The water is warm, almost bathwater warm, as the landing craft pitches through the waves toward Peleliu's western shore. Marine Private Jack Morrison clutches his rifle, salt spray mixing with sweat on his face. He's 19 years old, from Ohio, and he's about to learn something the maps never showed him, something the intelligence officers missed entirely. As the ramp drops and he splashes into the surf, his boots hit something solid 3 feet underwater, sharp, unforgiving, ancient. The coral reef extends hundreds of yards, and it's about to turn this beach into a slaughterhouse. Morrison doesn't know it yet, but only 15% of the men in his assault wave will make it across alive. The enemy isn't waiting on the beach. The enemy is beneath his feet, in the water, embedded in the geology itself. This is the story of how nature became the most effective weapon in the Pacific War, and how thousands of Marines learned that sometimes the greatest danger comes from what you can't see. If you want to understand the real history of warfare, the parts that changed everything, make sure you're subscribed, because we're diving into the stories that never made it into the textbook. It's September 15th, 1944, and Operation Stalemate II is underway. The target, Peleliu, a 6-mile-long volcanic island in the Palau chain, roughly 500 miles east of the Philippines. Strategic planners in Admiral Chester Nimitz's Pacific Command believe this island must be taken before the invasion of the Philippines can proceed. They're convinced Japanese airfields here threaten General Douglas MacArthur's planned landing at Leyte Gulf. The 1st Marine Division, battle-hardened from Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester, draws the assignment. Intelligence estimates 3 days of fighting, maybe 4 at most. The actual battle will last 74 days and become one of the war's costliest mistakes, both strategically and in human terms. The assault plan calls for 3 regiment-sized landing forces to hit beaches designated White 1, White 2, Orange 1, Orange 2, and Orange 3 along Peleliu's southwestern coast. The 1st Marines under Colonel Louis Chesty Puller will land on the left flank. The 5th Marines under Colonel Harold Harris take the center. The 7th Marines under Colonel Herman Hannikin will secure the right flank and southern peninsula. Pre-invasion naval bombardment has been ongoing for 3 days. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers pumping thousands of shells into suspected defensive positions. Carrier aircraft have dropped napalm and high explosives across the island. When the smoke clears on the morning of the assault, officers in the command ships look through binoculars and see what appears to be a moonscape. They believe nothing could have survived. They're catastrophically wrong. What American planners don't fully understand is that they're not fighting the same Japanese army they encountered in 1942 or even 1943. Under the new defensive doctrine developed by General Tadamichi Kuribayashi and implemented here by Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, Japanese forces have abandoned the wasteful banzai charge tactics that cost them so many lives in earlier battles. Instead, Nakagawa has spent months turning Peleliu into a fortress of interconnected caves, fortified positions, and underground tunnels carved into the island's limestone ridges. His 10,000 defenders aren't positioned on the beaches where naval guns can reach them. They're dug into the interior, into a hellish landscape called the Umur Brogul Mountains, which the Marines will come to know simply as Bloody Nose Ridge. But before any Marine can reach those ridges, they have to cross the reef. The coral formations ringing Peleliu are ancient, built over millennia by tiny polyps depositing calcium carbonate skeletons in intricate razor-sharp structures. These reefs are ecosystems, 3-dimensional mazes of stone that extend both horizontally and vertically through the water. At low tide, some sections break the surface. At high tide, they lurk just beneath, invisible. The reef structure here is particularly brutal, sharp as broken glass, hard as concrete, irregular and unpredictable. It's not sand, it's not mud, it's fossilized ocean life that can slice through canvas and leather, that can trap a man's leg or gut him if he falls wrong. American amphibious doctrine in 1944 relies heavily on the Higgins boat, the LCVP, or landing craft, vehicle, personnel. These 36-foot plywood and steel craft can carry 36 men and are designed to drive straight up onto sandy beaches, drop their front ramp, and disgorge troops directly onto shore. They've worked brilliantly at Normandy just 3 months earlier. They worked at Tarawa, despite the coral there. But Peleliu's reef system is different. It extends further from shore. It's more irregular. And most critically, the tide tables are wrong. The assault is scheduled for high tide, when intelligence suggests there should be at least 4 feet of water over the reef, enough for Higgins boats to pass. But Pacific tide patterns are complex, influenced by lunar cycles, seasonal variations, and local geography. On September 15, 1944, the tide is lower than predicted, much lower. As the first waves of landing craft approach the beach, coxswains realize with growing horror that they can't make it over the reef. The boats grind to a halt hundreds of yards from shore. Some coxswains try to power through, only to hear the sickening crunch of propellers striking coral, the sudden loss of steerage, the boat swinging broadside to enemy fire. The Marines have no choice. They have to go over the side. Private First Class Russell Davis, a machine gunner with the 1st Marines, later recalled the moment. The coxswain yelled that we'd have to walk in. Walk, like it was a stroll to the corner store. I went over the side into water up to my chest, and immediately my feet hit something that felt like broken concrete. Every step was agony. The coral was tearing through my dungarees, cutting my legs. I could feel blood mixing with salt water, and we still had 300 yards to go. This is where the nightmare truly begins. Marines laden with 60 to 70 pounds of equipment, rifles, ammunition, water, rations, grenades, mortar rounds, are forced to wade through chest-deep water across a coral field that punishes every step. The irregular surface makes it impossible to maintain balance. Men stumble, fall, and when they try to catch themselves, their hands hit the same razor coral. Cuts open immediately, and salt water rushes in. The pain is excruciating. Some men, weighed down by equipment and wounded by coral, lose their footing entirely and slip beneath the surface. Their buddies try to pull them up, but doing so means stopping, and stopping means becoming a stationary target. Because while the Marines struggle with the reef, Colonel Nakagawa's gunners have a perfect field of fire. Japanese defenders positioned in reinforced bunkers along the beach and in elevated positions on the ridges have been waiting for this exact moment. They held their fire during the naval bombardment, staying deep in their caves and tunnels. Now, with Marines trapped in the water, they open up with everything they have. Type 92 heavy machine guns, firing 7.7mm rounds at 450 rounds per minute, sweep across the coral flats. Type 38 rifles crack from concealed positions. Knee mortars, the Type 89 grenade discharger, lob 50mm shells that explode in the water, sending coral shrapnel in every direction. The Marines can't run. They can barely walk. They can't dig in. There's no cover, just water and stone. They can't shoot back effectively because they're focused on not drowning. They're in a kill zone, and the only way out is forward. One agonizing step at a time. Corporal Charles Rowan, a squad leader with the 5th Marines, survived the crossing but lost half his squad doing it. You couldn't hear yourself think over the gunfire. Bullets hitting the water sound like someone snapping their fingers right next to your ear. Snap, 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 everywhere, all at once. Miller went down about 20 yards in front of me, just slipped under and didn't come back up. We tried to get him, but a mortar round landed close and we had to keep moving. You had this terrible calculus in your head every second. Do I help him, or do I try to make it to the beach? How many of us have to die trying to save one guy who might already be dead? The casualty rate in those first waves is staggering. On Orange Beach 3, where the 7th Marines land, nearly 60% of the first assault companies are killed or wounded before reaching dry land. On White Beach 1, Colonel Puller's 1st Marines suffer similar losses. The regimental commander watches through binoculars from the command ship and sees his assault waves simply disappear into a maelstrom of fire and water. Radio reports are chaotic. desperate. Heavy casualties at the reef line. Can't get across. We need amphibious tractors. The amphibious tractors, LVTS, or Landing Vehicle Tract, also known as Amtracts, offer a solution, but a limited one. Unlike Higgins boats, these armored vehicles can crawl over coral reefs on their treads. They can drive straight up onto the beach. The problem is, there aren't enough of them for the initial assault waves. Most are being held back for supply runs. Now, commanders frantically redirect every available LVT to rescue Marines trapped on the reef and shuttle follow-on waves to shore. But even the Amtracts aren't invincible. Japanese gunners have learned from previous battles. They target the thin-skinned vehicles with 47mm anti-tank guns and 75mm artillery pieces positioned in reinforced bunkers. An LVT might make it over the reef, only to take a direct hit 50 yards from the beach, erupting in flames with its entire cargo of Marines trapped inside. Those who survive the initial impact often burn to death before they can escape. Private Eugene Sledge, whose memoir, With the Old Breed, would later become one of the definitive accounts of the Pacific War, was in a later wave at Peleliu. He described approaching the beach in an LVT. I could see the wrecks of other Amtracts burning at the water's edge. Some were still full of dead Marines. The smell hit us before we landed, a mixture of burning fuel, explosives, and something else, something sweet and terrible that you never forget. That's what death smells like on a large scale. The driver of our Amtrak was crying and praying out loud. I don't blame him. We all thought we were about to die. Those who make it across the reef and reach the actual beach find no relief. The beach is not sand, but pulverized coral and volcanic ash, gray and black and lifeless. There's no cover except the wrecked landing craft and the bodies of the men who landed before you. The heat is overwhelming. Temperatures hover around 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and the humidity is suffocating. Men who've been soaked to the skin in salt water now bake under the tropical sun. Uniforms stiffen with dried salt and blood. Coral cuts, even minor ones, begin to fester within hours in the heat and filth. And the Japanese fire never stops. Nakagawa's defensive plan is brilliant in its simplicity. He's not trying to repel the invasion at the water's edge. He knows the Americans will eventually get ashore. Instead, he's maximizing casualties during the most vulnerable phase of the assault. Every Marine who dies on the reef or beach is one fewer rifle pointed at his defensive positions in the ridges. Every Marine who spends an hour struggling across the coral is exhausted before the real fighting even begins. The reef isn't just a natural obstacle. In Nakagawa's hands, it's a weapon system. By nightfall on September 15th, the Marines have established a precarious beachhead, but the cost has been appalling. The 1st Marines suffer 1,298 casualties on the first day, roughly 35% of their strength. Some units are effectively destroyed as fighting formations. Companies that landed with 200 men are down to 60 or 70 effectives. The beaches are littered with destroyed equipment, burning vehicles, and rows of dead covered with ponchos. Wounded men lie in the sand waiting for evacuation, but the same reef that nearly killed them on the way in now makes it nearly impossible to evacuate them efficiently. The problem repeats itself in reverse. Hospital ships offshore can't bring smaller boats close to the beach. Wounded Marines have to be loaded onto Amtracts, driven back over the reef, an agonizing journey for men with shattered bones or abdominal wounds, and then transferred to boats in deeper water. Many wounded men die during this evacuation process, bleeding out or going into shock during the rough transit across the coral. Medical personnel work with desperate intensity, but they're overwhelmed. Battalion aid stations on the beach are barely protected, and Japanese artillery continues to fall throughout the night. The psychological toll is immense. These are experienced Marines, veterans of previous campaigns, but nothing has prepared them for the grinding horror of Peleliu. The reef crossing has shattered units, separated friends, killed officers and NCOs who held squads and platoons together. Survivors sit in shell craters through the night, wondering how they're still alive, wondering how they'll find the strength to keep fighting tomorrow. What the Marines don't yet realize is that the reef crossing, as terrible as it was, is just the beginning. The real battle, the fight for Bloody Nose Ridge, will make the beach assault look almost merciful by comparison. But the reef's impact on the battle doesn't end with that first day. For the next 2 months, as the battle grinds on, every supply run, every evacuation, every reinforcement has to cross that same coral barrier. The reef becomes a constant drain on resources and morale. Landing craft are destroyed faster than they can be replaced. Tide tables are triple-checked against local conditions. The ratio of Amtraks to Higgins boats is increased dramatically. Lessons written in blood at Peleliu save lives at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The battle itself continues for more than 2 months after that first day. The Marines eventually secure the airfield and the southern portion of the island, but the fight for the Brogol, the ridges, becomes a protracted nightmare. Colonel Nakagawa's interconnected cave system proves nearly impossible to root out. Marines fight with flamethrowers, explosives, and rifles in close quarters, combat that resembles the trench warfare of World War I more than modern maneuver warfare. Eugene Sledge wrote in his memoir, "The ocean at Peleliu wasn't blue like you see in the travel brochures. It was gray-green and full of death. The coral wasn't beautiful like in a nature documentary. It was sharp and mean, and it hurt us worse than some of the Japanese weapons. I used to wonder, years later, why nobody warned us about the reef. Why didn't somebody know? But that's war, I guess. Half the things that kill you are things nobody planned for." Russell Davis, the machine gunner who survived the crossing, never went swimming again after the war. He lived in Nebraska, 1,000 miles from any ocean, and never regretted the distance. In an oral history recorded in 1998, he said, "People ask me about the fighting, about the combat, and yeah, that was hell. But the worst moment of my life was being in that water, trying to walk across that reef, knowing I might die before I ever got to fight. That helplessness, that's what stayed with me. I have nightmares about drowning, about being trapped, about not being able to help the guys around me. 60 years later, and I can still feel that coral cutting my legs." Charles Rowan, the squad leader who lost half his men on the reef, became a school teacher after the war. He rarely spoke about Peleliu, but when he did, he focused on the small acts of courage he witnessed. A kid named Phillips, I don't even remember his first name, he got hit in the shoulder out there in the water. Bad hit, bone showing, and instead of panicking, he held the squad's radio above his head to keep it dry while we helped him to shore. Saved the radio, died 2 days later from infection that started in his wounds from the coral. That kind of thing. That's what I remember, not the general's plans or the strategic objectives. I remember Phillips holding that radio up like it mattered more than his own life. The reef at Peleliu is still there, of course. The island is now part of the Republic of Palau, a peaceful nation built on tourism and environmental conservation. The reefs are protected. Divers come from around the world to see the coral formations and tropical fish. The water is clear and beautiful. On the beaches where Marines fought and died, there are small memorials now. Rusted Amtraks still sit in the surf, monuments to that terrible September day in 1944. Every year, a few elderly veterans make the journey back. They come with families, with grandchildren who want to understand what Grandpa went through. They walk the beaches, stare out at the water, and remember. Some cry, some stand in silence. A few wade out into the surf, letting the warm water rise around their knees, confronting the geography that nearly killed them 70 years ago. It's an act of courage that most people never recognize, facing the place where you learned what fear really is, where you watched friends die, where you became someone you're still learning to live with. The hidden killers beneath Peleliu's water taught the Marine Corps lessons that saved countless lives in later battles. The institutional memory, preserved in doctrine and training, means that modern amphibious forces approach reef systems with a sophistication and caution born from that blood-bought knowledge. In that sense, the men who died on September 15, 1944, contributed something to the generations of Marines who came after them. But that's cold comfort to the families who got telegrams that autumn. That's cold comfort to the survivors who spent the rest of their lives wondering why they lived when their friends didn't. War teaches many lessons. Some are tactical and strategic, easily transferred to manuals and training regimens. Others are deeper, harder, more personal. The men who crossed the reef at Peleliu learned that nature can be as deadly as any human enemy. They learned that you can do everything right and still die because of factors completely beyond your control. They learned that survival sometimes has nothing to do with skill or courage. Sometimes you live because you happen to be in one spot instead of another, because a bullet went left instead of right, because you didn't lose your footing at the wrong moment. Those are lessons you carry differently than tactical knowledge. Those are lessons carved into your soul by salt water and coral and the weight of men you couldn't save. The reef doesn't care that it killed thousands of young men. It doesn't carry memory or guilt. It just exists, ancient and indifferent, doing what coral reefs have done for millennia, building itself slowly, one polyp at a time, creating beauty and barrier in equal measure. The ocean washes over it twice a day, tides rising and falling as they have for eons. The fish return. The ecosystem thrives. But for the men who fought there, the reef will never be just geology. It will always be the place where they learned that war is not noble or glorious or clean. It's chaotic and cruel and often pointless. And sometimes the greatest dangers come not from human malice, but from the simple, terrible fact that the universe doesn't care about your mission or your courage or your buddies or your mother waiting for you back home. That's what the hidden killers beneath Peleliu really were. Not just coral and tide and geography, but the cold truth that in war, everything is trying to kill you, even the ground beneath your feet and the water around your body. And the men who survived learned to carry that truth for the rest of their lives, honoring the friends who didn't make it by living as fully as they could with the memories of what they saw and felt on that terrible day when the Pacific became a graveyard and only 15% of some waves made it through. They did their duty. They paid a price that should never have been asked of them, and they deserve to be remembered not as heroes in a glorious story, but as young men who faced something impossible and did it anyway because they had no choice, because their friends were beside them, because that's what the moment demanded. The reef at Peleliu stands as a monument to all of that, to courage and to waste, to sacrifice, and to the terrible mathematics of war, to the boys who went into the water and the men who came out, forever changed by what happened in between.